Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Why can't you use callback pins on the release birds like they do down south a lot? And they do condition those birds, and they do mix in with the wild birds, and they do a lot better. I'm not saying they all live, but they condition those birds on a recall pin and let them out every other day or every day. It seems to prolong the birds.
Yeah, and there's people that do that, in Maryland, and you can get them to survive a little longer. You protect them from predators, and like I said, there's some systems out there where you can make them live a little bit longer. But to really think that you can just rely on pen-raised birds to reproduce and become wild is kind of unrealistic.
So they don't really take the all like they do with the wild turkey, catch wild birds and reintroduce them into other areas to build up the stock or the.
You can do that, and we've actually done it on one property, and it seemed to work. They'll live, and their data shows that some percentage of them will live. But the two issues with that are, where do you get the birds from? There's where in the country is there a surplus of quail? So it's a difficult thing. A lot of states want wild quail. I think Pennsylvania actually just worked out something where they're going to bring wild birds in to release. And then the other issue is, well, why aren't there wild quail there in the first place? And if you haven't changed that the landscape to the point where wild quail can come in there on their own and survive, then what makes you think that bringing wild birds in from some other state is going to make a difference? So that's kind of the thing. Turkeys are a little bit different in that they were basically extirpated over large areas, and there was no source population. But we're getting to that point in some parts of the state where there probably isn't quail to fill in if you do habitat work, and that's why we did a little project where we trapped some birds and moved them, and like I said, they did seem to survive. We put a lot of man hours into catching those 6 or 8 coveys that we caught that one winter, but it's a time-consuming thing when you have real low densities. Good question, though. And while we're on myths and misconceptions, just going to throw out there turkeys and quail, friend or foe. There's a lot of people that will tell you, well, turkeys will eat baby quail and they'll stomp on their nest, and turkeys are messing up quail and grouse, and there's all kind of, turkeys have messed up everything, and it's all the DNR's fault. But we put those birds there. Really, they're and it's reasonable to assume this. Quail populations have decreased at the same time turkeys have increased. It's the same. It's the exact reverse trend. And what you need to really ask yourself is this cause and effect? Are they really linked together? Is there a true relationship there? And really the answer is no. And there's really not been any documented cases of turkeys harming quail populations. The habitat really has changed, and we talked about this. Succession has replaced good quail habitat with turkey habitat. Something that's interesting, though, is that places that have good numbers of quail and good quail habitat also have a lot of turkeys. Turkeys use quail habitat for nesting and brood rearing, which is a critical time for turkeys. So a lot of times you see really strong turkey populations where you have quail. Doesn't work the other way around, though. There can be plenty of turkeys in a mature forest and no quail. And so we go back to, habitat is still the key. It's what biologists have been preaching for decades, and we realize the role of predators, but this is the one thing that we can really change, and we can modify the habitat to the point where we can minimize predation pressure. So we go into some of the general things that you can do for managing habitat on your property. You need to start out with knowing what quail habitat is and some of the requirements. We'll just go through sort of the couple of the key things that they need throughout the year. Nesting habitat is critical. It's not necessarily too specific. Oftentimes they nest at the base of these grasses, native warm season grasses. Here's a quail nest up at Chino Farms. See, it's just in a large grass field, and they just sort of hollow out a little area down there and build a nest bowl. But they'll nest in the woods and hedgerows. It's not too specific, but this is the preferred habitat. Something to consider when you're talking about providing nesting habitat, and particularly if you are thinking about putting in buffers, field borders or filter strips with some of these programs, is the size and configuration of these buffers. Here's 2 quail nests, theoretical quail nests on this property, and he's got a narrow strip around at one field, and over here it's a much larger strip. And if you had a predator hunting these strips, this fox, he's got bird dogs. They're grouse hunters. There's people here that have bird dogs. Fox can, is doing this every day. It's not. He's probably a little more fine-tuned than a bird dog in finding game birds. It's not going to take him long at all to find a quail nest in a 20-foot strip of grass. And if your dog can do it, he can do it. On the other hand, over here on the other side, that fox has less of a chance of finding that nest. And you might end up with a successful nest, which is something that doesn't happen very often with today's landscape. So, the larger the block of nesting habitat you have, the higher likelihood that you're going to have some successful reproduction. And I think that's one reason why that very large field at Chino Farms that I've sort of referred to a few times now was so good, because it was just such a vast area. It was about 200 acres, and predators just could not, where do you start looking? It all looks the same. There's no edges to follow, and they saw a lot of successful quail nests there. So, wider is better. However, a narrow field border or filter strip, whatever you want to call it, narrow strip of cover along the edge of your field is better than none at all. Brood habitat is basically a place where they can find insects. There's cover to conceal them from predators, but they can also move around. Okay, so that's the 3 components of good brood habitat. It's the same for turkey brood habitat. Bare ground is something that you'll hear quail biologists talk about a lot, and a lot of landowners get confused on this. We say, well, you need bare ground so the birds can move around. And went out to one farm, and he said, man, I got plenty of bare ground. He had like half of the place disced up. I mean, it looked like he was getting ready to plant beans. He said, look at all this bare ground for the birds. That's not really what we're talking about. We mean underneath the vegetation. There's places where, basically he can, a small bird, a quail chick is the size of a ping pong ball, where that bird can move around without getting saturated by wet vegetation, and can move around and run after a grasshopper, go out there and get them without tripping over himself. So that's what we mean by bare ground. One of the old ways to figure out if you've got a good area for brood habitat is take a baseball and roll it through there. That baseball rolls through without getting hung up on weeds, and you have enough bare ground. But the key is you can't, if you're rolling that baseball through, you can't be visible from the air. So if you've got a hawk hunting that area, you want enough cover between that ground level and the air so that he's concealed. Ragweed serves this function perfectly. Ragweed fields, there's a lot of open space there for birds to move around, but they're concealed up top, in the summer and early fall. Okay, some things I just said. Fescue and other cool season grasses, even like orchard grass and things like this that are planted, they really limit movement of birds and choke out, good plants. They tend to form a thick sod, and they're just not as good as some other plants. Escape cover. This is also called maybe winter cover. It's very important and really important based on the results of our research project. It needs to be dense enough to keep predators out, which is really difficult. And a predator like a Cooper's hawk is really efficient at maneuvering through hedgerows and through cover. But the thicker the better. They need a place where they can dive into when they're getting chased by something. A lot of people call this the covey headquarters. You know, it's where they really hang out. You know, they'll be there in the middle of the day. They'll, you know, and then they'll go out to feed for an hour or two and come back to this place. It's sort of their safe zone. This is probably the type of habitat that's most limiting on most farms that I go to. It's difficult to create and maintain this type of cover. Putting it all together, just basically you need all this within the home range of a quail, which isn't that big. They will, you know, travel a couple miles if they have to, but you know, most of the time they're going to spend the majority of their time within probably a 10 or 20 acre area. So you need to have all these components right there. Let's talk about some of the management strategies. I mentioned native grass establishment. There's a variety of species, and you know, you could talk a lot about the planting rates and the species selection and how high they get and the management of the grass. But you know, basically, there's ways to get a really good field of grass that's going to benefit quail. You just need to consider, you know, factors and talk to somebody that knows about you know, what's good and what's bad. There's been a lot of these fields planted with taller varieties, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 foot tall grasses that get really dense, and birds just will not use them. So there's some other species that are a lot better. I mentioned before that fallow fields are a real easy and effective way to get quail habitat out there. And if the landowner has the choice between planting native grass or just letting the field go fallow, this is your best route for, you know, in most situations. The only exception is if you have real bad noxious weed problems. You know, if you're in an area that's really thistle prone or something, you might not want to do this. But in a large part of the eastern shore, we don't have those issues, and you can get away with just letting the field go fallow, seeing what comes in there, and you're going to have good plants. You're going to have ragweed, foxtail, broom sedge, partridge pea. All that stuff is in the soil. It just needs to be released. You know. Field borders. This is the same photo, but you can put these around your fields. It's a sort of a traditional method to manage for quail. Shrub and hedgerow plantings are an effective way to get that escape or winter cover out there. You can plant red cedars, variety of different shrub species you can plant, a lot of the shrub dogwoods, and you can even plant loblolly pine, let it grow for 5 or 6 years and get nice shrubby hedgerow, and then, you know, go in there and bush hog them or whatever. You know, they're cheap and they grow fast, quick cover, and then let them grow back up. You know, you have to manage it. And you can plant these species by hand or with a tree planter. Edge feathering is something that it benefits a lot of wildlife species. Like I said, early successional habitat is everything that's not mature forest. To get that feathered edge, you know, you don't want that abrupt transition from mature trees to crop field. You can use a variety of different methods. You know, here we just took a dozer along the edge of the field and just tore stuff up. And you can do a lot of good for quail by just tearing stuff up. You just get on the tractor with the real heavy-duty bush hog and just run around, and, you know, any trees, 2-inch trees, you know, just chop them down and make it look real random, and stuff will grow back. You know, the soil disturbance is great. You get a lot of good species coming in there, and eventually you get your briars and everything coming back in, create a nice edge.